Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The deadline for the United States to leave Afghanistan is nearly here as the United States continues evacuating people out of Kabul. The U.S. government says over 100,000 people have been evacuated alone just these past 2 weeks, but there will still likely be many more, especially Afghans who work with the United States over these past 20 years, that won't make it out by the August 31st deadline. After last week's suicide bombing at the Kabul airport, killing 13 U.S. soldiers and many more Afghan citizens, this withdrawal from Afghanistan is very likely to remain an overall symbol of countless failures of a war that lasted 20 years. Today, we're going to be talking about all of this, and we're going to take a step back and look at how we got into this war, look at the war on terrorism itself, and the changes to the law that occurred just after the 9/11 attacks that are still with us today. My guest for this conversation is Karen J. Greenberg. Karen Greenberg is the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and she is the author of the book, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy, From the War on Terror to Donald Trump. She joins me over Zoom. Karen Greenberg, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
It's wonderful to be here.
What are your thoughts as you've been watching what's happened in these past couple of weeks in Kabul? And here we are on the eve of the August 31st deadline. So much to talk about it. What's first and foremost on your mind when you look about what's happening in Afghanistan?
Well, I think first and foremost is just a sense of sadness over how chaotic and dangerous it's been and at what cost to so many people. And my other thought, and it's in tandem with that first thought, is that, in one way or another, this is what it was going to look like. And for a variety of reasons. And so I think a lot of Americans are struggling with sort of a complexity of things at the same time, which is a 20-year war that was had already accomplished the aims it was set out to accomplish, that was taking a lot of American energy, resources, et cetera. And at the same time, knowing that the getting out would be messy. And so I think that, that's you have to hold both those thoughts together in your head and then understand that, Biden has stuck to his commitment to this, to getting out. Every president before him at one point or another talked about getting out. He decided to do it. And it's time. It was time a long time ago.
Do you think the difficulty of getting out now points to, is that one reason, clearly not the only, but one reason why it had been so difficult even after presidents from Obama on said that they would end this war?
You mean that's why we didn't get out? Because it would be so, of course, I'm sure there were, there were briefings on how chaotic it would be, how unstable it would be. What's interesting, you're kind of raising something interesting because on the one hand, you see these reports that, the United States has been successful in training Afghans and able to defend themselves and building up some kind of robust government, more robust government. And the fact that there was also this sense that getting out would be extremely fraught tells you that these are two different narratives, right? One is that everything's going along in a way, presumably like it should be. And the other one, but if we try to get out, everything's going to fall apart. So you can't have it both ways. So I think that's what your comment points to.
Do you think this could have been handled differently, the getting out of Afghanistan?
Well, I think it could have been handled earlier. And had it been happened earlier, it would have happened maybe differently. But, I do think it was going to be difficult no matter what. But, earlier is a big difference, right? Earlier is a big difference, not just in terms of what it looks in terms of getting out, but in terms of what can come afterwards, where the U.S. can devote its energies, et cetera.
It seems to me, and I'm not one necessarily to full-throatedly defend Joe Biden when it comes to Afghanistan, because I remember very well in the early years of the war and the reconstruction effort, he played a big role in policy towards Afghanistan as the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But this may sound a little vulgar, but it will fit within what's allowable by the FCC guidelines on radio. I do have a saying about war, and that is when you invade a country, you screw the people when you go in, you screw them when you stay, and you screw them again when you leave. This is what happens in this kind of situation. And the more I read about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and clearly the way they're doing it has not worked very well, right? I mean, you could criticize the way that this has happened, but it seems to me that they were caught a bit in a catch-22, because the alternative would have been to keep troops there and then withdraw everyone out while all the troops were there. But what they were hoping was that the government that the United States has basically propped up ever since the invasion of Afghanistan and onward, is that would remain at least for a while. And if you were to withdraw everyone while that was still in place, including the people that helped the United States over these last 2 decades, then that would have been seen as precipitating the collapse of the government that it had installed. So I think even if they did it differently, this would have been terribly tragic.
That's a really good point. Also, this has been an amazing withdrawal. I mean, 120,000 people have been airlifted or gotten out of there. That's extraordinary. And they are talking about plans for being able to use, not necessarily flights, but passages out even after the 31st. So, I mean, as chaotic as it looks and as dangerous as it is, I think that they may have not quite have known the magnitude of this turmoil, but they knew this was not going to be easy. And I think you're right. I think your narration of how it would have appeared had the troops stayed would have been very different. But I do think you have to acknowledge how many people have been lifted out and what an extraordinary effort this has been, and I think will continue to be in its own ways afterwards.
Right now, though, the national narrative over this is what a disaster it is. And in some ways, I think people, especially who are howling indignation, righteous indignation on television, interestingly, many of those people omit or sidestep the fact of their own roles in helping us get into the war to begin with. I mean, if this withdrawal from Afghanistan is a failure, and I said this in my introduction, it's along a line of a number of failures that have happened over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, the withdrawal in some ways was baked into the beginning of the war on terror. The way this particular invasion was launched was imprecise and vague, and we can go into that. The pivot from one purpose of being there, which was to rout out Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, to another person for being there, which was nation building, civil society building, security advising, was done without any attempt to clarify it, to think about what that meant. It was just assumed that the authorization to begin with could be summarily changed without changing any of the legislation, without confronting what was being done. Not that we didn't know, but still, it wasn't reflected on. It wasn't thought about critically. It wasn't dealt with. It's just like so much else in the war on terror. We start one place, and because we don't limit what can be done, we go any place we want. And so I do think that the ending and the way we used the original authorization for this war, the 2001 authorization, is somewhat culpable for where we are now.
And this gets us into language, and we're going to talk in a moment more about language in the war on terrorism and how that has helped get us to where we are today, because there's a lot about what you write in your latest book, Subtle Tools. Before we do that, though, one last question on the current moment. What do you think happens here on out after tomorrow? It's interesting to see, at least as part of this evacuation and trying to secure the Kabul airport, the United States military and the Taliban seemingly working a little bit together on that. What do you think happens afterwards with the United States national security and Afghanistan? Are we going to have a CIA presence in Afghanistan? What's going to happen there?
So that's a great question. And I wish more people were thinking about that than just criticizing what's going on right now, like what's going to happen and what should happen. I do think that, to the extent possible, the intelligence agency will, want to be present as much as possible. I do think there will be some kind of a greater degree of multilateral investment in thinking about the future of Afghanistan, and particularly in understanding what the levers of economic negotiation are. Afghanistan is a country that experts say is on the brink of financial collapse, not hardship, but absolute collapse. So much of the money comes from outside sources, and international bodies and more. And there is the argument that this can be used in a way that insists upon and is contingent upon certain issues within the country, and whether those have to do with human rights, whether those have to do with civil society protections. I think that is a point of leverage. I do think that the issue of women and children is profound in Afghanistan, as we hear daily in the press, and I do think some of these economic leverages can be used for that. In terms of America's military presence, so far as we know, there's no close base that they're going to be able to conduct military operations from. But I'm assuming that kind of thing will work out. But from the beginning, the Biden administration has stressed multilateral participation in the world. And if there's anywhere where this should be multilateral and thought out in a broader scope, it's going to be on Afghanistan. And so in some ways, this can set a template for that, help set a template for that. I think, I think it's going to be go as you will. I think there will be negotiations with the Taliban. I think that, and not just with the United States, from other countries around the world, wanting to participate in this multilateral conversation this way. Whether or not the Taliban will get what it wants, which is recognition of statehood from countries around the world, we'll see. But that too is a point of leverage. So I think all of these things are possible. But I do think that this is a very important moment in bringing to an end the period of the war on terror, that for reasons that are that I reflect on in the book, for example, we still live in the bubble of the post 9/11 era, and in many ways that is problematic. And this is a rough ending. There's no question about it, but it's a significant ending. And whatever happens next, it will be a new chapter, and we're moving on into that new chapter.
Living in the bubble of the war on terrorism, but and also with the legal parameters of it.
Correct. I mean, we still have, as I referred to the authorization for the use of military force from 2001. It's really hard to believe that we're still operating under that authorization, given that it was in the immediate hours after the attacks of 9/11, created for the purpose of routing out the people who had conducted 9/11 and who had given them safe harbor. So think about that. Now, how much has changed in the landscape of terrorism and counterterrorism, and yet this is still the authorization from country to country, from one kind of military maneuver to another kind of military maneuver, from Al-Qaeda to a host of other forces that are Al-Qaeda-like, maybe Al-Qaeda associated. It's been used as an ever expansive authorization. What's very interesting about it now is that there has been some movement to think about repealing it and replacing it, and thinking about what actual the country needs authorization for the use of force for. And that was just getting started now in these early months of the Biden administration. And now I'm not sure what will happen with that. Now it's a different story. I'm not sure how it will, what form it will take, but we'll see.
Democratic Representative Barbara Lee for years has been trying to repeal the 2001 AUMF. It has gained more traction, still hasn't occurred. She was the one person to vote against it back in 2001. Where are we currently in that political fight, I guess? Where
we are in this political fight is there is some kind of draft that's circulating. where we really are is that the 2002 authorization for the force in Iraq has taken precedence in terms of repealing that. And as that has gone forward, the tag on has been, and next we're going to do the 2001 authorization and begin, because that's not just repealing, that's replacing in the eyes of many within the Congress as the realistic goal. And so we're sort of at the end of the 2002 one and the very beginning of the 2001 discussion, but there's no question this is going to affect it. Let's just talk about Barbara Lee for a minute. Amazing that in 2001, she was able to say, this is not the road to go down. This is not who we want to be. We need to think about this. This is going to have blowback in way and a legacy in ways we don't want to take on. And think about that. It was quite brave. And yes, many times she's tried to bring up the sunsetting of the 2001 authorization. But no, it hasn't happened.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Karen J. Greenberg, who's the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law and author of the book Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy, From the War on Terror to Donald Trump. Let's talk more about these AUMFs, which stand for Authorization of Use for Military Force. And you mentioned there's actually two we're dealing with. One, 2001, just days after the attacks of 9/11, and then another one later dealing with Iraq particularly. What is an AUMF?
That's also a very good question because traditionally, when you go to war, there's not traditionally, up and through the Second World War, when you went to war, the country went to war, there was a declaration of war for the most part. And those declarations of wars are very interesting to look at, particularly the ones, for example, in World War II, where a number of countries were on the opposite side as enemies. And the authorization for the use of military force, which even though all of the congressional debate was about war, there was no question we were going to war, didn't want to use the word war. And it was for a variety of reasons, most of them not to give side of a open-endedness to what authorities could be invoked, etc. The authorization for the use of military force gave the president the power to make the decisions within the context of terrorism-related activities that threaten the country. And it was presumed to be and stated to be against those who had aided, supported, carried out, etc., the 9/11 attacks. But no enemy was named. In the World War II declarations of war, the enemy was named in every single declaration for every single country that the United States went to war with. Not only that, there was no battlefield. Part of that's understandable because transnational terrorism, etc., but they could have been more specific about it. Instead, they created this idea that there was no battlefield to be named, so there were no geographical limits. And finally, there was no temporal limits. There was no sense that the end of hostilities would occur. In other authorizations and in other declarations of war, that's often somewhat vague. It'll be sort of said like, and when the end of hostilities occur, or when the president decides the hostilities are over, or some version of something. This didn't even refer to the end of hostilities in that way. And so as a result, this was an open-ended mandate for the president to use power in the name of terrorism in any way he wanted. And that's what we saw in president after president after president. And that's what Barbara Lee saw. And so it's a very interesting evolution of the authorization for the use of military force because, you know, in a way it was baked into the beginning that it would be misused. And Congress, in many ways, was giving up its powers to declare war in specified ways in different, time zones. Now, the president, when he, launches some sort of attack, has to let Congress know within 48 hours under the War Powers Resolution. But still, this was handing the president enormous powers, and it's what happened elsewhere in government as well, not just in the war context, in the war abroad context.
Do AUMFs exist before the war on terrorism? And if so, then what happens? It goes through a transformation in how they're used in 2001, or did that transformation occur earlier?
No, even in the authorization, let's take the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, okay?
Vietnam.
Even there's a specificity, a geographical specificity that is put in place to name the enemy. And so, no, this was a new level of vagueness. And again, it wasn't a new level of saying, we want to sort of be in the interstices of, who has the power here, but it was a new level of, it wasn't completely novel, but it was a new level of vagueness. And, look, after 9/11, it's understandable they could have gotten away with it. The real problem in this is that, and this is throughout the war on terror in terms of laws, policy, norms, there was never a reset. There was never okay, we reacted one way after the shock and tragedy of the attacks of 9/11. But after a certain period of time, there needed to be a sense of, okay, you know what? We understand what happened. We're moving along to try to make ourselves safer and have made great steps in that regard, particularly in the early months in Afghanistan. The American invasion of Afghanistan in terms of routing out al-Qaeda and destroying havens is considered across the board, successful in accomplishing that aim. But there was no reset, not on this and not on the so many abrogations of norms, governance, laws that we saw in the war on terror.
Well, we went from trying to destroy al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to nation building in Afghanistan. How did that happen? And would it have been appropriate to go in and just take out al-Qaeda and leave all in entirety? I mean, I remember at the time, people would point to Colin Powell, who famously said, if you break it, you have to fix it.
Yes, he and others. But let's just talk about what happened in Afghanistan. What happened in Afghanistan was that, as I said, during the first months of the war on terror, the use of military force in Afghanistan was reportedly remarkably successful in routing out al-Qaeda and its havens and its safe havens. And finally, in December of 2001, at Tora Bora, bin Laden and many of al-Qaeda were surrounded. And rather than complete a battle that was precipitous in Tora Bora, Donald Rumsfeld decided to pull out troops, to not have this battle, and to focus the attention of the American national security establishment in thinking about going to war in Iraq. And so the pivot happened from Afghanistan to Iraq, and took place, over the next year until we eventually invaded Iraq. And the issue there is that, for one thing, bin Laden escaped, right, from Tora Bora. So what we did in terms of Afghanistan, we had already decided not to do anymore by turning to Iraq. That was we're no longer on this mission. The idea that we had to therefore take care of Afghanistan and help build, nation building, maybe it's not for us to decide, but maybe it was for Congress to decide. Maybe instead of saying the authorization for the use of military force is anything we do in Afghanistan is okay, they could have come to Congress and come to the American people and said, what do you think we should do next? Should we build a nation? And if so, is the military how we're going to build this nation? If we want to build a nation, what would we do to build a nation? So the irresponsibility was not so much in staying there, but in how we stayed there and how irresponsibly imprecise we were about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. But there's another piece of this, which is that this idea that you can bait and switch, that you can start with one premise, move to another premise. So you have counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, nation building, that you can sort of switch from one to another at will without authorization on who say so, on the president say so, and therefore on the people that are closest to the president say so, or the people that have the biggest presence in Afghanistan. And perhaps the final piece of this part of the conversation is that so many of the reports coming out now are about how inaccurate the reports were of what happened in Afghanistan, while the Americans were there after Tora Bora in so-called nation building, that the reports were coming back, oh, they're doing fine, things are better, the Afghan government is strong, we're helping them with a variety of things, women and children are going to school, which, by the way, was true. There were some advances in civil society, some important advances, but a lot of it was inaccurate. And a lot of it may have been intentionally misleading. And so the presence that stayed there, we didn't even know why we were there, but we also didn't know what was actually happening there. And that's one of the things we're finding out now in the withdrawal. Is the authority, our authority, our own legal authority of being involved in Afghanistan all comes from this 2001 AUMF? It does. And there's been times when the president may have said, I'm using my commander-in-chief powers for one thing or another thing. But yes, our presence in Afghanistan is under the authorization for the use of military force. Karen Greenberg, your book, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump, you go into sort of the use of vague language, bureaucratic confusion, secrecy, the flouting of legal norms to talk about kind of what has happened in the last 20 years. And you do use this 2001 AUMF a lot to especially to analyze language. And let me just read it here because it's not very long. And it just says this, quote, that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. Talk to me about the significance of that language that I just read. It's the breadth of it. It's, first of all, who's the enemy? Can you name me the enemy after reading that? So it would have been either somebody that had aided or helped plan the 9/11 attacks or would plan any future attacks against the United States. Yeah, okay. So that's not naming an enemy. That's naming a threat. And it's hard to have an authorization against a threat in a way that can be contained and precise and responsible. And so that's, that's essentially, I call this the document in the war on terror, sort of the very, very initial idea that in being unspecific and imprecise, we don't know what's going to come down the road, but we have the powers to do whatever we want with whatever comes down the road. And so that's what's wrong with that. Foundational to the war on terrorism. Yeah, exactly. It also opens up the door, and this is something I don't talk about a lot in the book, but it also opens the door to this fuzzy barrier between non-state actors and nation states. So in other words, would there ever be a time when the nation states itself, Saudi Arabia or others could have been, could have been under this purview? And so it's actually a very dangerous document, not just theoretically, shouldn't it have been nicer? Or more precise, or, not nicer, but more precise. Do you think it purposely ended this way? I mean, they passed this 2001 AUMF just days after the 9/11 attacks. Was it a product of just we had to do this in a hurry, or do you think it was deliberately worded this way? I think it was deliberate, not necessarily because of maliciousness, but because of fear and the power of fear to say, we're going to do whatever we can. This is not a time to limit ourselves. And that was a winning argument. Having said that, let me just say something which I do write about a little more in the book, which is that the original draft of the authorization for the use of military force was broader and talked about the ability of the president to be able to use his powers against, those who he thought would be, a terrorist threat or an enemy to the United States, which was way broader. And many pushed back against it, including Russ Feingold, who was like, no. And they succeeded in having that taken out of the original authorization. And so when it passed, so that speaks to your question of what did they think? They were passing a more narrow version than what had originally been proposed. And so there's also that in how the story unfolded. So we've been talking a lot about the AUMF, but there would be other
things that would come shortly afterwards, after the 9/11 attacks, that still have created these legal parameters in the war on terrorism that are still very much in place today. Maybe they've been changed a little bit over the years, but fundamentally the structures are still there. One of the main pieces of legislation and laws that were approved at this time was the Patriot Act, something we haven't talked as much about in recent years. But does the Patriot Act fall in this sort of same genre of use of language and what it has done as, say, something like the AUMF?
The Patriot Act, yes, it does, but in very different ways, meaning that the Patriot Act took many things that law enforcement had been asking for a very long time. And some of them were legitimate. For example, updating laws to accommodate for the internet age, updating investigative authorities on the part of law enforcement to be able to deal with that level of surveillance and how that all needed to be addressed. But there were other things that legislators and lawyers and others had been asking for that were really to expand the powers of law enforcement in the country. And so the Patriot Act is the threshold document that allows that to happen. And what's problematic about, there's many things in terms of what it authorizes that are problematic, but what's also problematic about the Patriot Act is that, talk about bait and switch. This was an act that was definitely used against counterterrorism. There's no question about it. But once the rules were on the books, it wasn't limited to counterterrorism and to the counterterrorism narrative. So it created a broadened, one of my points is really that the things that were done initially in the war on terror expanded authorities, whether they were military, whether they were in law enforcement, whether they were the executive branch at large, just expanded the authorities to in ways that were unprecedented and that we haven't recovered from. And so the Patriot Act did this, big time in terms of taking dozens and dozens of statutes and saying they need to be changed. And there are many things that are at issue here, but the one that has really concerned civil libertarians and constitutional scholars and many just public officials the most is the expansion of surveillance authorities, phone metadata collection, which we've been hearing about for years, and other authorities. And so this threshold moment, which basically said, in the name of terrorism, the government now has the powers to be able to do this, was extraordinary. Another thing that I talk about is and this is the Patriot Act and beyond, is the way in which law enforcement and intelligence agencies were now allowed to share information. This was a norm that had been violated for a long time, set up by Janet Reno, Attorney General Janet Reno, but still something that norm is now they could share things, which meant that the rules regulating collection of foreign intelligence are different than the rules about domestic affairs. And so what they did, and there are more protections under the domestic realm. And what it did was mix up those authorities. And so that was another example or an example of something I talk about throughout the book, which is this kind of merging of authorities that were separate before this, but now were commingled. And in that commingling, a lot of constitutional protections disappear. Due process, Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, First Amendment. So many things were all of a sudden opened up for a renewed interpretation without the time and space to think about it, to calculate, the give and take of it. And so it set us on a certain path. And it's still with us. We now have the Freedom Act, which does not have the same broad bulk collection, warrantless bulk surveillance, but there's still so much surveillance that goes on, and so much of what goes on, I think we don't know about. There was a couple of the programs, one in particular, Stellar Wind. I don't know that we'll ever find out everything that was authorized and collected. And the Patriot Act did not authorize every single one of these excesses, but it did set the stage for the fact that we were in a new paradigm in terms of thinking about restraints on law enforcement. And more important than restraints on law enforcement was keeping the country safe. And the kind of message was, if we compromised liberty, which is how it was referred to at the time, it's okay, because better to be safe. And that was a moment we haven't recouped yet.
This conversation is interesting to me because as all these things are happening in the first couple of years following the 9/11 attacks, I was a much younger reporter covering these things. And being that I've worked even then with Pacifica Radio and my home station KPFA and all of this, we always gave a lot of attention to the critics of these things. And I can't help but think, yeah, this is what, there weren't a lot of critics at the time, but there were critics at the time. And this is a lot of what they were warning about at the time seems to have happened. And maybe it's even hard to notice. It's sort of a frog in a boiling pot. As you increase the temperature, you don't really notice because it happens over a period of time. But we live in a very different world now than we did prior 9/11.
It's interesting that you say that because, for those of us who teach, our students now, if you teach college, your students weren't born on 9/11. If you teach graduate school, law school, something of that ilk, they were 3 or 4 years old. So we are teaching students who now accept the world that this book is about in ways that, how do you remind them that something else could have been here, that something else was here? It's hard to say we've lost something. They didn't lose it. They were born into this. And so the question remains, who will these next generations be? Which I find really fascinating and interesting to see how this sort of sense of, to put it in those simple terms of liberty versus security will affect them. I do think it's fascinating that we live in an age where fear is so prevalent, right? If it's not climate change, if it's not pandemic, if it's not terrorism, if it's not, a great power, if you read the news every day, all it's about are the threats, or it's, primarily about the threats that confound us. So these children are growing up in an age where they will not be shocked by threats. They will be able to say, yes, we've had threats all our life, but maybe there's a way to do this in a way that doesn't react primarily out of fear, but that takes other moral and human considerations into account. It's very possible.
There's many people who are now saying that what happened this year at the Capitol on January 6th, when Trump supporters attacked the Capitol building, that was this era's new 9/11, or, it needs 9/11 type of commissions to investigate it and everything. And I don't mean to defend the people that attacked the Capitol. The video is there to see how horrendous it was, but it does seem to be a bit of an overstatement, one, to me, to compare it to 9/11. But I do want to ask you, and you may disagree with me entirely in all this, but are there, how we respond to what happened on January 6th, is there danger there? And I guess for me, and I don't mean to make this about me, but for me, as a former Capitol Hill correspondent, the one thing I always liked about the Capitol itself was the openness to it, that you could get in there. You could even see lawmakers. It was very different than, say, the White House or the Pentagon or many other places of government in Washington, D.C. The Capitol had this much more of an open nature where people could come, they'd visit it. It was like a museum. You can go see your representative, whatever it may be. And I feel those days are now over.
So these are two different questions. One is, about the civic promise of America, right? Of being able to have that kind of openness. The other was a question about 9/11. And, was January 6th the point of 9/11. This is, I think, let me try to separate this out here. I think that January 6th was in many ways one of the first signs that we were going to move on from the war on terror. Just by saying, this is our new 9/11, it was, okay, finally, somebody's willing to say we're not living in what I've referred to as that bubble. So just in the symbolic way, yes. But there was another part of that that's 9/11 responsive, which was that, or important, which is that, the idea was 9/11 was out there. And, our president successively said, we're going to keep the war over there. That was, the promise George Bush, for example, in the beginning made the nation, right? The idea of this replacing 9/11 as an era of American concern is that the threat came from within, and that the threat was not others. The threat was us. Right? The threat from within us. So in terms of a paradigm shift, it does replace 9/11 in that way. In terms of what it means for the country going forward, it's a different kind of response that will have to go on. And you've seen sort of the arrests of individuals, mostly charged with minor charges, not all, but mostly. And we'll see how these play out. I think a lot of the importance of, and this is not rocket science, a lot of the importance of the Capitol riots and the insurrection was to bring attention to what happens next in the political scene. And how we validate or view that date will have everything to do with the legs of this sort of white nationalist supremacist movement and how important it becomes politically, et cetera, et cetera. So I think time will tell in terms of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I will say that a lot of the flaws in the architecture of the post 9/11 culture of governance, right? Led eventually, I would say, to the riots happening in the first place, by which I mean, why didn't anyone respond? Okay, there's an answer to that question. Now, if you look at what happened in June of 2020 in Lafayette Square, when the president took the Bible, remember, and walked to the church during the Black Lives Matter, okay. Do you know how many law enforcement agencies showed up? More than 12. Because I think there are 16 agencies that are tasked with keeping the Capital District safe. And everyone was there, and they came armed, and they came, prepared, and no one showed up in January. Okay, why? Now you could say it was because only the Capitol Police have access to this. No, there was. We'll have to get to the bottom of this, but why no one showed up is actually speaks to the kind of bureaucratic confusion that I write about throughout the book, that starts with, profoundly with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and that extends through a number of things. And, among the agencies that should have shown up were many that belong to the Department of Homeland Security. Not all of them, but many of them. Who was supposed to be there still seems to be a question. This is an example of bureaucratic confusion that we've been living with for a long time.
Department of Homeland Security, this is a post 9/11 department.
Yes, the Department of Homeland Security, an attempt to bring together departments and agencies from throughout government, from Treasury, Transportation, Health and Human Services, Justice, Defense, Agriculture, and more. FEMA, for example, putting FEMA in there, creating TSA, and putting them all together with the idea that together they could do a better job keeping the nation safe. The premise that more inter-office, inter-agency communication about threats is important is a good one. The idea that you throw together different missions, different agencies, different chains of command, and different lawful abilities and authorities into one agency and expect it to function was a non-starter from the start, and it's been And not only that, Department of Homeland Security is now our largest law enforcement agency. It works in tandem on many occasions with the Department of Justice. So this is a vast expansion of our law enforcement apparatus since 9/11. Hurricane Katrina showed just how confused Department of Homeland Security was, and And although there have been many attempts to make it better over the years, the use of the Department of Homeland Security for non-counterterrorist activities, which is what it was established for, has been profound and vast. And I can point to either what's happened at the border or the use of troops in Portland or the idea of using agents to protect election sites around the country. So this is a agency that, like the authorization for the use of military force, has a mission that seems to be able to change on a whim.
Karen Greenberg, before we wrap up, I do want to ask you about the subtitle of your book. And the title of your book is Subtle Tools, but the subtitle is Dismantling of American Democracy, from the War on Terror to Donald Trump. I'm interested in this line, from the War on Terrorism to Donald Trump. My thoughts, and this may be different than yours, and I want to know yours. The line I have always seen between the War on Terrorism and Donald Trump is that the War on Terrorism made a Donald Trump presidency possible for many reasons, but one of them being because eventually I think people on the right felt lied to, and that Donald Trump was a break from the George Bush Republican Party, and that because of the War on Terrorism, because so many soldiers going to a war to fight for, and afterwards maybe not knowing really what they were fighting for, became disaffected and distrustful of the government. And that made a Donald Trump presidency possible. But you, that's me. You tell me your thoughts of the War on Terrorism to Donald Trump.
So my thoughts about less about how he got elected and the election process, than about what Obama and Bush left on the table that are less obvious, that's subtle, tools. So in other words, it wasn't just the policies they created, right? It wasn't just the use of the Patriot Act, the use of the authorization for military force, the use of DHS. It was the means by which these things were brought into being and implemented. And that so we can change policies, we can sunset the AUMF, we can do whatever we want to change what we see. But the mechanisms by which this was brought about, which are intentionally imprecise language, calculated secrecy, bureaucratic confusion, and a willingness to abrogate norms and laws. Donald Trump saw those tools on the table. And if you look at what he did, he used each one of these tools in an exponential way. For example, secrecy. Secrecy, and there have been other versions in earlier administrations during the War on Terror and attending to terror and other things where similar things happen. But Donald Trump made a conscious decision not just to be secret, but to withhold information. And not just to withhold information, let's say from Congress when they subpoenaed top government officials, but to not create the record. We'd seen this in the past with certain things in immigration, et cetera, but this was a sense that we won't take notes at certain meetings. We won't write down the children and their parents who are being separated from one another at the border. If you don't correct if you don't write down the record, if you don't document it, if there's no documents, how can you be held accountable? How can anyone know? And in all of these other ways, I think he used the tools as well. That's
interesting to me. And forgive me, I just want to throw this in there while we still have a couple of minutes left. I see a direct connection. Again, I remember as a young reporter on Capitol Hill, seeing charts that showed how much more documents were being classified than ever before, and the rise of secrecy. And this, what Donald Trump, what you're laying out, sounds just like a part of that. I know slippery slope is used as a way to say you shouldn't make these arguments, but still it sounds like it's in that trajectory.
If you look at the number of classified documents that there were, that were made classified under Bush, which was an exponential rise in classification, and a pattern that continued. President Obama comes into office and he says on one of his first days in office, among the things I care about are transparency. We are not going to have this level of secrecy that we now see in this war in the Bush administration, much of it attached to national security. But however, when Obama's record on transparency is not great, particularly in requests that are filed under Freedom of Information Act requests, his were higher than Bush's in terms of denying them, right? His administration. In part, I think this has to do with something we haven't talked about, but that not wanting to get into the weeds of what went wrong in the war on terror, and not wanting to just have to get into the accountability for Bush officials who did, created, for example, the torture program, authorized, for example, warrantless surveillance, legal authorities for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in that way, even though there are other ways in which Obama was willing to be much more transparent, the legacy stayed with us. And so this is what I mean by leaving the tools on the table. It's one thing to say, I want to be more transparent, and another thing to put in mechanisms so that you have to be more transparent. And that did not happen.
Karen Greenberg is the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and she is the author of the book, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump. Professor Greenberg, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a wonderful conversation.